and diving into application management. Now, application management is the next set of capabilities that Systems Manager allows us to use. It's a suite, if you recall from our presentation, that it allows us to manage our applications running in AWS. So the first thing we want to do is I'm going to go over resource groups. Now, under resource groups, you can see I have some defined, and we're going to go ahead and create our own here in a minute. But resource groups are going to allow us to organize many different resources within AWS all in one group. And this is going to allow us to perform actions and automation on several resources with one particular automation task. Now, automation is coming up in the next section, which is actions and change over here on the left. But resource groups are a staple for Systems Manager. So it's important that you understand how they work and how you can use them. Now, before we get started, just some background here is I spun up two different buckets. You can see one's dev and one's prod. And then I also spun up two different instances. And if we look at the tags here, you'll see dev, and then you should see prod. Perfect. So we're going to use these resources to demo how resource groups work. So I'm going to click on Create Resource Group, and this brings us to our group type. Now we can either search for resources based on tags, or we can search for CloudFormation stack-based tags. Now we'll do both, but for this first go around, let's do tag-based. So now that we have tag-based selected, we go to Grouping Criteria, and this is where we can select what type of resources that we want to collect and add to this resource group when we search. You can see there are tons of resources in here, so be sure to check this list out on your own time. For this case, I'm going to do all supported types. Now let's go ahead. I'm going to give this an environment key value, and then for the actual value of this key, you'll see it auto-populated. I'm going to do prod. We want to group all of our prod resources. So if we wanted to, I could click Preview, and it's going to give us a group of our resources that belong to this resource group based on our query there. So all of these resources right here near the bottom all have a tag of prod with the environment key. So now if this looks right, we can scroll down, we give our group a name, we can give it a description, we can give our group tags, so this will apply tags to the resource group but not your actual resources, and then we can click on Create Group. And there you go, it's that easy. So we've now just created a resource group which has production-related resources all in one group. So now we can use this later on, and you'll see how in upcoming clips, and we can perform automation based around these groups. So let's go back and let's just look at the CloudFormation stack-based group type. So I select CloudFormation stack, and then we can see the different CloudFormation stacks within this region for our account. So these first two are my web servers that I deployed, and then the bottom two are our different buckets. So let's just go ahead and do dev web, and we'll do all resources that are supported once again. So if I preview this, you'll see we get two resources. There's an instance, and then there's a security group. And if I go to this instance, so 71E2 is what it ends with, and if I go to tags, this is what it's using right here in order to query for this resource group. This is the CloudFormation stack ID that's used when we create this group. So if I go back, that's where these two resources are coming from. So we can give this a name now. Let's do dev web servers. We can give it a description. I'm going to click on Create Group, and there we go. We now have a dev web servers resource group that contains any resource from that dev CloudFormation stack that I deployed. So now if we go to saved resource groups, we can see our dev web servers here, and then our prod web resources. So now if I go back to Systems Manager, and I refresh this page here, we're going to see our new resource groups that we just created. So now we can go in here quickly, we can view our details, and this gives us all of the details of our resources for our group. You can see there's a details pane, we have config. So if we have config rules in place, it would show their compliance here. We have our CloudTrail section, so we can check the different events that have occurred on our resources. We can monitor it with CloudWatch metrics and CloudWatch logging. And then we have our ops items. And if you recall, we went over ops items when we were in Ops Center. And this is where we can go ahead and perform operational related tasks specific to our resource groups. And the last thing I want to show, we're not going to really go all the way through it, but we can execute automations. So this is what I was talking about when I was discussing actions and change on the left in automation. Now I'm not going to do this right now. We'll demo this in upcoming clips, but it's important to be aware that you can perform automation tasks on your resource groups. So let's go ahead. That's going to do it for resource groups. It's very important that you understand how these work, as they are a fundamental piece of knowledge that you need in order to properly use Systems Manager, at least at an efficient level. There's other ways to do it, but it's not going to be the most efficient way. So let's go ahead and wrap up here, and then in the next clip, we're going to start discussing AppConfig. Okay, welcome back. Let's dive into AppConfig. Now, AppConfig is another capability under application management, and it allows us to use Systems Manager to quickly create, manage, and deploy different application configurations. Some interesting use cases that are provided are application tuning, so we can test our app and then make config changes quickly. Or we can even enable a feature toggle for a new feature that we're pushing out with our application. So if we want to show it at some times and then not at others, we can quickly toggle a feature on and off. Now I'm going to go ahead and click on Create Config Data, and let's just create our application. So we'll give this a production application name. We can give it a description, and then we can also give it some tags. So if I wanted to, I can do environment and then prod. And building off the last clip, this would allow us to tie this into our prod resource group that we created. So I'll click on Create Application, and there you go. We have now created our application in AppConfig. Now, I'm not going to deploy a true application here, but let's walk through this as much as we can, and then I'll touch on pieces that we're not actually going to do. Now, the first thing we have to do is we have to create an environment. So an example of this might be test. We can set our monitors, so what kind of role do we want to use for CloudWatch alarms, and we can specify the alarm itself. So if we want to tie in alarms, we can do that. We can create more tags once again, and then I click on Create. So we've now created our test environment, and it's ready for deployment. So if I go back to AppConfig, I go into my production application, and let's create one more environment. So I'm going to call this prod. We'll create it quickly, and there we go. We now have two environments for the same application. So this mimics a real-world scenario where you would push deployments to test, and then once they're tested and successful, you can quickly deploy them to prod. So let's go into test here, and you can see we have a Start Deployment button. So if I go to Start Deployment, we have to create or choose a configuration to deploy. Now we don't have any, so let's go ahead and click on Create, and this is where we give it a name. We can give a description, we can create a new service role or use an existing, and we can create more tags. So I'll click on Next, and this is where we configure the source provider. So where are we actually getting our config data from? You can see we can pull from parameter store, which we'll talk about later. We can pull from a document, which we'll also cover a little bit later, or we can pull from S3. We can point to an S3 object that holds our configuration data. Now, once again, I don't have any config to deploy, so we're not going to go through this, but you can see the next step is add validators. Now, what add validators does is it allows us to add a validation for AppConfig to use as a checkpoint before actually deploying this config. So it's kind of a stopgap measure to make sure that everything's correct before it deploys. You can see once we choose our configuration, we would get a version option as well. So this is what allows us to quickly change the versions of our AppConfig that we're deploying. And then we move to deployment strategy. So what kind of deployment strategy do we want? You can do linear or exponential as a deployment type. So for linear, what this is going to do is it allows AppConfig to push out the deployments in small defined increments based on the number that we put into place. And then exponential is going to use a growth factor here, and it's going to exponentially deploy the resources. So they're a little bit different in how they work. So essentially, if we have several resources, it's going to start with 2, and then 4, and then so on and so forth by an exponential factor of 2. And then the final 2 settings that we have are our deployment time, so we can specify how long we want this to run, and we can specify a bake time. So how long is it taking our systems to get up and fully running before they're considered complete? So this is similar to a load balancer in the fact that you can perform health checks, but you specify a cooldown period or a grace period that allows you to say, hey, we don't know if this is good or bad yet, but I want to hold off and give it some time to come up properly. So from here, I would create my deployment strategy, I would give a deployment description, and then I would start my deployment. Now, I don't have a config set, so this won't work, but that's how easy it is to deploy to one environment for your application. And then once we tested everything appropriately, we would see our deployments down here. We could go back to our prod app application. I can go into prod, and we can do the same thing here. We can use a deployment using the same config profile that we specified, a similar deployment strategy. We can quickly identify which version we're pushing, and then I can start that deployment for my prod group of resources. Now, this is a very new tool to Systems Manager. It's a really neat one, so really go through here and check this out and see how it can help you with your application configuration needs within your AWS accounts. For now, we're going to wrap up here, and then we'll pick up again with parameter store coming up next.